And to look at how some perspectives fare side by side, I'm joined by former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrassov in London, and in Washington, D.C., senior fellow at the Security Studies Group, Matthew Brodsky. Gentlemen, it's always a pleasure to have you with me. Mr. Nekrassov, we'll start with you. What is Russia's motivation in putting these defence systems into the hands of Syrians? Some say it could be quite a risky move.
Well, I think that the Russians did have to respond to the downing of this pipeline. And I think it's a very soft response, to be honest with you, because although it's a modified S-300 PM system with a radius of 200 kilometers, I don't think it's the most sophisticated system Russia has, like S-400 PM. And I don't really think it changes the situation very dramatically. But it's a signal to Jerusalem that Russia will not tolerate any sort of dangerous flying over Syria, and basically that is not something that will create a crisis in the relations between the two military.
All right, Mr. Brodsky, to you. We're hearing from Mr. Nekrassov there that this is, in fact, rather a soft response. We've heard from US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that this is, in fact, a major escalation. Is it?
Yeah, and actually it's an escalation that is more designed to send a message to Washington, who should be playing the balancing role against Russia as Israel strikes Iran inside of Syria. The entire basis of Israel being able to strike Iran at its own pleasure, basically, throughout the country, is dependent on the understanding, not an agreement, but an understanding that it has with Moscow for this. So clearly we know that Russia has not previously been using the S-400 or S-300 by its air base in Khmeimim because Israel had been using its non-stealth F-16 fighters to carry out missions that are within miles from that location. In this scenario, though, it depends on who the operators are going to be. There's supposed to be a 3-month training period on the S-300s that were delivered. And if they're operated by Russia, which is to say that they therefore do nothing, then it doesn't change the strategic game too much. If, however, Syrian operators start firing off like Wile E. Coyote from the cartoons, as they do in the wake of every other Israeli attack, and just shoot random missiles into the sky, then Israel is going to have to reapproach how it attacks Iranian positions, whether that means relying more so on the F-35 stealth technology that it has.
All right, then back to you, Mr. Nekrassov. As I suppose Mr. Brodsky is pointing to, Russia, of course, has its own interests to protect, but when it comes to its arrangement with Israel, for example, is it of no concern that these systems could prevent the Jewish state from protecting itself from Iran?
Well, I don't really think, as I said, it's not a game changer. I think that basically what we've seen in the last 3 years is that there's a quite effective communication between the military of the two countries, I mean Israel and Russia. And of course, it's a very tragic incident, and we still don't really know the exact details of what happened. But I think, to be honest with you, this is not the sort of response you would have expected if Russia was planning something drastic, you know, if it was really planning to cause serious problems for Israel. I don't really think even F-16s would have a lot of problems in the current situation. So I think both countries want to avoid any crisis. I think that the Israeli armed forces have shown restraint in the past 2 weeks after the downing of the plane. I think it's actually bears a good signal that maybe, you know, the communication is going well. They understand the delicacy of this situation. They understand that the public opinion in Russia is slowly changing against this war, and Putin will have, you know, a tougher time to convince his people that this war needs to continue. And I think it's going much better than I even thought after the incident itself.
All right, let's move into studio and bring another voice into the conversation. I24 News senior Middle East correspondent Mohammad Kassim is still with me. Mohammad, how does this move change the game in your assessment?
Well, it changes the game on a number of fronts here, Tracy. First, between Israel and Syria. Now Syria feels that it has a more advanced weapon, that it could retaliate against Israeli airstrikes, and also it gives it that kind of confidence that it did not have in the past. In the past, because of the low range and also the lack of advancement in its air defense missiles, they were just shooting at everything and anything. Now they may be more restrained, but also it's good news for the Iranians, at least for the time being. They know that there may not be any Israeli attacks happening anytime soon. It gives them some freedom, much needed freedom to move about Syria. But it's definitely not good news for Israel, even though I do agree with those who say that this is not really a huge game changer. It's not the S-400, for example, anti-defense system. It's still advanced enough to stop some of the Israeli attacks, but it's not so critical that it will completely stop Israel.
But could Iran be looking at this turn of events as an opportunity?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're saying about Iran maybe having some free movement right now, especially that we haven't seen any activities over Syrian skies in the last couple of weeks since this incident. So this definitely is good news for Iran, and it will continue to be good news until we see how Israel will adjust its game and strategy and tactics of how to deal with the next airstrike and how the Syrians will be responding.
All right, and Mr. Brodsky, back to you in Washington, D.C. From a United States viewpoint, of the viable other options now, would the US want Russia, in fact, as the top dog in Syria?
Well, the overall context is that the United States has been basically dealing Russia a series of setbacks inside of Syria, whether it comes to the agreement that it had reached with Turkey for Idlib beforehand, which prevented Russia and Assad and Iran from taking over that territory, or whether it was the decision for the U.S. to remain in the northeast, over 30% of the territory, which holds 95% of all the oil and gas revenue. So you have basically the United States challenging what Russia thought would be an easy skate toward an endgame in Syria, and instead the U.S. is preventing that from occurring, according to Russia and Assad's liking. So this is Russia deciding that it's going to push back against the United States and against Israel, of course. So there's going to be a decision that needs to be made as far as Washington is concerned, because if Israel is not going to be able to fully push back against Iran inside of Syria, then the United States is going to have to do it, because they both share this as a goal. Russia is going to be unable to prevent that.
All right, Mr. Nekrassov, back to you in London. It was, of course, a Syrian missile that hit that Russian jet, yet it was this event that saw Assad's forces, I suppose, rewarded with extra protection. Why is that?
Well, as I said, it was a response. The Kremlin needed to do something about it. There was an uproar in Russia. You know, everybody was expecting some sort of move, so they had to do it. But I disagree with the fact that, you know, the Russians agreed on Idlib with Turkey as a sort of a concession to America. The concession was that the Russians are waiting for the November elections in America. Trump is under pressure. There were voices coming from Washington of threatening and so on and so on. So they decided to delay this. Idlib will be taken. I can assure you that. It will be taken by the Russians and Syrians. So yes, they made a pause. The Turks begged them to do this as well. The Turks are looking at a serious problem with 1 million refugees at least crossing the border. They need to sort this out, they need to prepare and so on. So that was a concession, but a temporary one. And as I said, Idlib will be retaken.
All right, Mr. Brodsky, back to you. You've written about Russia's post-war ambitions in Syria. What does this signify to you about how Russia sees its role in Syria moving forward?
Well, it sees its role as the arbiter of all events and all security matters. And so, first of all, aside from the fact that it doesn't like that the United States is staying and has already made threats to the United States to attack at its Al-Tanaf garrison or to do more cross-river raids into the northeast, Russia is essentially trying to recapture territory so it can not only present itself to the international community as the protector of Assad's future, therefore it's open for business as usual, to gain international funding, which of course will be abused, but it also has made a lot of deals with the Assad regime for the oil and gas revenue, which again is right under the United States' feet. So without this, Russia is essentially spending a lot of money, and now just past its third anniversary of its involvement, it has very, very little to show for it other than the sale of S-300s, which if need be, Israel or the United States will simply take out because they don't pose the worst kind of challenge as a S-400 would. So Russia is in this bind.
Right, many interests, many views. I want to appreciate you all for sharing those perspectives with us. Former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrassov in London, Matthew Brodsky, as always, from Washington, D.C.